Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Double B's Garage. Today we are going to be messing with my 1998 C43 AMG. You probably have seen this in separate videos before. When I picked up the car originally, the headliner was bad, I had that fixed. The interior was dirty just because honestly it looked like it had never been cleaned, but the car had sat for about 5 years. And then I also addressed some stuff in the engine with leaks, valve cover gaskets. The valve covers actually have two parts to them. In the video, you'll see kind of all the stuff we did for that with a special Mercedes epoxy and glue around that area along with the gaskets. We did spark plug wires, we did spark plugs, and I ended up having to address a couple coil packs that were creating a misfire. From what I've understood is these coil packs are very robust. So I have a spare that I bought as an extra, but they said do not change the coil packs unless you have an issue with them, and then you throw a code on what the misfire is and on what cylinder. There's 8 coil packs in this car for 16 spark plugs. And if you have a misfire on number 4, then you know that coil pack most likely is bad and you can test it and check it. I replaced the spark plugs and the spark plug wires as mentioned. And then I also replaced the crank position sensor. In these cars, when it gets hot, if you stall and then the car dies and it won't turn back over until it cools down, 9 times out of 10 or even more than that, it's the crank position sensor. It's right behind the back end of the motor by the firewall on the driver's side of the mass airflow sensor, and it's relatively easy to get to, and we also show you how to do that in the previous video. Today, I'm going to be addressing the motor mounts. I got the Lemforder. They're German. In my opinion, they're closest to OEM as you can get. They're about half the cost of normal mounts. I think I paid $110 for 2 mounts and maybe even the transmission mount. Maybe it was around $120. But I think normally the Mercedes mounts, if you buy them from a dealer or from an OEM supplier, you can pay upwards of $120 per mount. So these are saving money and they're virtually the same thing. Now, some people choose to put in the C55 mounts in these cars. They say they're a little more robust. I haven't looked that much into it. I mean, this car is a daily driver. It was for the previous owner. As mentioned, it has 179,000 miles on it. All the service records, I bought it from the original owner and the family. But now I'm just putting in factory mounts. I mean, they're good. They work well. There's no reason to really, I'm not tracking the car. I'm not being aggressive. I don't need to go to another mount that has polyurethane in it or actually a solid mount. The reason why I'm changing these mounts is because they have lost their hydraulic fluid and the mounts are flat. And after I get them out of the car, I'll be able to show you the difference in height with these factory mounts and the ones in the car. The problem that it creates when those mounts are flat is it basically is like setting a motor on a block of wood between the car frame and the motor itself. So everything drives very smoothly when you're going down the road, but when you come up to a stop sign, you're in drive, you're at the red light, and your foot's on the brake, you get a lot of vibration through the car because there's nothing absorbing that engine vibration as it sits there and idles at a light. The motor runs very cleanly and very calm. There's no misfires or jerking around. So I've kind of pinpointed it or assessed the fact that it's probably the motor mounts. One thing I also did was bought a transmission mount when I did the motor mounts because they say that can go bad as well, and it's one of those things while you're in there you might as well fix it, so we're going to do that today as well. On these cars, it's a little different than the C55s. The C55s, you have to take off the you have to take off the driver's side exhaust to get to the motor mount from the back of the car. And then the passenger side motor mount on the C55 comes out fairly easily through the front after you remove a couple lines and gain a little better access. And then, of course, jack the motor up once the bolts are removed. In this process, you want to remove the top bolt first because that's obviously what the motor is sitting on. And then you can remove the lower bolts. And then you lift up the motor, which I will use that jack over there, the lift pole. And lift the motor up a little bit so I can get the new mounts in. Clearly, you want to support the motor weight when there's no mounts. And then secondly, the new mounts, because they're factory originals, they're going to be a higher profile because these are flattened out. So you need to have the motor up a little higher. On top, I removed the beauty covers that attach to the MAV, the airbox, and the beauty cover with the Mercedes logo. I did that just to give me a little extra visibility around the firewall. But you don't need to take off the MAV sensor in these cars. Remember, the car originally, the motor was higher in its original position. So we're just getting back that space that we had before. I'm not worried about anything bumping into something else. I did look around the firewall and around the back side of the motor to make sure I felt there was plenty of room. but it should be a fairly easy job. I'm going to show you now kind of what it looks like in here. So when you pull off the beauty cover on the bottom of the Mercedes, you can look up and there is your motor mount right there. And then there's the other one. It's a 13mm bolt on top and right underneath. 13mm, 13mm. It's very, very simple. Bolt on top, bolt on the bottom. I'll jack it up from the oil pan here with a block of wood to disperse the weight across the whole pan. And then after I do this, I will come back and do the transmission mount, which is right back here. 2 bolts. You don't have to take this cross member off. You should be able to take the 2 bolts out and then these guys, and that'll give us access to the mount. The one thing I wanted to address is all of this residue here. Now, this is a little wet, but for the most part, everything is basically caked in dry down here. This right here, I sprayed some on the exhaust bolts because I figured I was going to have to remove the exhaust. And then when I got down here, I realized you didn't have to. So that's just penetrating oil from the top. But all of this is basically dried up. The majority, almost every leak that I had was from years of the valve cover gaskets just seeping and leaking up there. And that is what's caused this kind of dirty area. You can see back here, I've cleaned up a lot of the motor that was there before. And now it is perfectly dry. And I have been driving this car probably about 300 or 400 miles. And there's no additional seepage, which means I fixed the culprit from above. So we're going to address this today. We're going to get the motor mounts out. I will get the top bolts done first. I will then jack up the motor. Well, I'll get the bottom bolts, jack up the motor. I will pull each mount out one at a time and replace it with what I told you I bought. These guys right here, the Lemforders I got from Parts Online. You can get these from FCP Euro and Euro Parts and some other areas. But I looked around to see who had inventory, just because obviously in the pandemic, you know, we're dealing with some shortages. So I wanted to make sure this was something that if I did order it, it would actually come. Also, make sure you're taking photos of the heat shields when you take the bolts out. I always recommend taking photos and bagging and tagging things if you're doing multiple jobs where you're removing a lot of hardware, because you can always go back and look at the picture for reference of orientation and where the bolts go. I'm going to be doing one at a time, so it's going to be pretty hard for me to mess this up, but I wanted to at least show you kind of what the bottom end looks like and then what we'll be doing today. So more to come here in a few. All right, so now that I got everything set up, I took off the cover. I accessed the motor mounts in the front here, as I mentioned before. I thought they were 13mm bolts, or nuts, excuse me, bolts, and they are actually 16mm, which was kind of a unique size. 16s, even when you buy a lot of socket kits and wrench kits, sometimes they don't even come with 16s, which is odd. But so I had a 16, I had a smaller wrench, and this really was not enough leverage to get the bolts out. There is a special tool that you can buy. You can find it on Amazon. I will put the link in my description of the video so you can buy it if you want to. And basically, it looks like a stubby wrench about this long. And you put the 16mm wrench on the top of the motor mount, and then on this end would be a 3/8 socket drive for an extension to go into. So you can come in from below and then turn that wrench on top of the motor mount. I was able to get this off with this small wrench, and what I did was I rested it on top of the bolt, and then against the frame of the car, I used a pry bar and just squeezed like this, and then it just kind of broke enough tension loose to where I could get my hands in there and loosen the bolts. So now the bolts are loose. I will loosen the 13mm ones from below, and then we'll pull these guys out and see what we get. Tell me how bad that is. Isn't that crazy how much that's been collapsed? That's exactly the same mount, and it is just insane how low that is compared to the other mount. So we're gonna have to jack the motor up a little higher to get this to fit. All right. So you can see by looking there, look how much that's collapsed in the top. Now it's flat down on the bottom and not giving the same vibration protection as it did before. So we'll put in the new one now, and we should be good to go. Now this would be easy to do if you didn't have a lift. You could put the car in jack stands. You could even drive the car up onto wheel ramps. There's no need to have the wheels off, especially in the C43. And then back here, it's the same thing. You could put a jack underneath this area with a block of wood or on the oil pan, just like I did. There's really no difference with regards to the ability to do that effectively. I think it would work out really well, actually. You know, you're just on your back. I used to do that for years until I could get a lift, and I graduated from a scissor lift to a two-post, which, I mean, as you can see, it's a game changer in terms of access to the whole underside of the car. Let's get this in a little further. Clear the exhaust. Done. So what I'll do is I'll get the cover button back up, because this has still got some residue on it from the leaks that, you know, were previously happening before I fixed the valve cover gaskets. I'll probably spray some of this down with some degreaser just to clean it off and, you know, get it a little cleaner, just so I can monitor anything down the road that decides to start leaking. I can know what's fresh and what's not. Really appreciate you guys watching and hope this was of value. I mean, it was definitely a learning experience for me, but as you can see, I mean, I think I did everything. And, you know, once I was set up, in under an hour. I mean, the motor mounts, aside from just having to lift the motor up a little higher, they went in relatively easily. I mean, we're talking a couple minutes aside, and then this was a no-brainer. So I really appreciate you guys watching, and you know, thanks for supporting the channel. And feel free to comment on the video, and I'll put the links in for that tool, even though I didn't end up using it. But I still ordered it, and I will have it in my inventory later. And then I'll put all the part numbers for these motor mounts, which they worked out very well, and we'll go from there. All right. Thanks again for watching.